What happens when a college classroom becomes the beginning of a much larger conversation? In this episode of Queer Stories of Recovery Voices from the Margin, Dr. Danny B. welcomes former students to revisit questions that extend beyond academia and into lived experience together. They examine addiction recovery through the lens of rhetorical theory, exploring how stories of recovery are shaped by language, power, identity, institutions, and culture. The conversation highlights how recovery narratives are constructed, whose voices are amplified, and how marginalized communities challenge dominant understandings of sobriety, truth, and belonging. Keep listening to hear more.
Hey everyone, what's up? It's Dr. Danielle Bacibianco. Welcome back to the Queer Stories of Recovery, Voices from the Margin podcast. Today's episode, Season 1, Episode 4, Beyond the Canon, a Post-Mortem on the history of rhetoric. I have some guests here today, which I'm very excited to have on this episode. They are upper-level students, English majors, and other double majors and triple majors, because, go-getters, and that's how we do. Some are graduating this semester, so very excited about that. Woohoo, woohoo, woohoo. Today we're going to be talking about a lot of different things. The first thing that we're going to really work through is this idea of what it means to preserve tradition, especially as far as the history of rhetoric is concerned, and why I'm here having this conversation and had that conversation with those students, and also coming from the work that I do as a queer addiction recovery scholar, and also somebody who's thinking about women and gender studies, and also thinking about the institution of academia as well as institutions of addiction recovery, right? And so, as we know, most academic institutions are still upheld by the walls of dead white men collecting the dust on bookshelves that nobody really actually reads anymore, except to cite them maybe perhaps in 12-point Times New Roman font. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been told more than once that I fail those men. That when I invite the margins into the center of the text, when I bring queer recovery, rhetoric, feminist recovery theory, substance use community literacy, and lived narratives into perhaps a history of rhetoric classroom, I somehow abandon true philosophy. But maybe the question isn't whether we abandon the canon. Maybe the question is why the canon has abandoned everyone else. Because here's the deal, academia loves theory. It worships metacognition, it thrives on abstraction. What it fears, and what it has always feared, is theory that begins to breathe, theory that begins to stretch the borders. Now, as far as addiction recovery theory, community literacy is concerned, that theory is embodied. And if we're practicing theory as scholars and we're researching or we're thinking about communities, we also have been informed that once theory leaves the ivory tower and, for lack of better words, walks into the church basement at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night into an AA meeting where someone is trying not to relapse, the institution wants rhetoric to stay in the shadows of that metacognition. It wants to observe communities from a distance without ever allowing those communities to speak back. Whether you tether Derrida to recovery, whether you put Bakhtin into conversation with harm reduction, when you allow queer survivors to interrogate Plato, or when you ask students to treat rhetoric not as a museum of artifact, but as a survival tool, the gatekeepers begin to panic. And honestly, in my opinion, I say good. Because last semester, these students and I committed a little bit of a rhetorical insurrection, right? We stretched the lines of academia, we asked a lot of questions, there was a lot of personal narrative, a little bit of political action, discussion about queer survival and recovery literacy. Now, some people say, well, on Queer Stories of Recovery, do we have to be queer to be guests on this podcast? No, it's the idea of participating in what it means to queer spaces. So in doing so, in that History of Rhetoric course, we queered the space of the academic classroom because we've asked some very dangerous questions. Now, what's really cool is that beyond that, class who also took their work and their thinking and have turned it into writing. Alyssa, who's on our podcast here, Alyssa Rivers, has also published an article, which she'll talk about a little bit, that was inspired from the class. So this is like really good stuff. And I'm also inspired here to collaborate with these scholars because I think it's cool that we're here today to push against the institutional ghosts that keep haunting higher education. Okay, so that's about it. I'm Dr. Danny B. So let's open up the conversation. So one of the things I like to do is I like to say to my guests, hey, is there something that you've been thinking about or that's on your mind before we jump in with the sort of like formal Q&A?
I would just say, since taking that course last semester, as a queer woman, I haven't had many other experiences where I was able to engage with actual academic texts that not only call a thing queer, but then discuss it further. And since then, I haven't been able to interact with texts like that, and I wasn't able to before. And now that I was able to actually do it, I feel this gap in my academic journey now that I don't have that anymore, that I'm really missing it. And I have been kind of trying to bring that in my other courses with assignments, like when can I bring, queer rhetoric or criticism, feminist criticism, other types of literary criticism into the picture in my own work if they're not assigned to me. But it's very difficult. Very difficult. So I'm just very appreciative that I was able to feel that, because now that I had it, I feel like I can't go without it.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you said that. I feel like that was also my experience when I was an undergrad and then also like a graduate student, on and on and on and on, which was been a while, right? You're thinking about the journey from 2003 until like 2021. And you saying that, like, one, I'm like, yay, amazing, I'm so glad you had that experience. But then I'm also like, what are we doing? Why are students needing to fill the gap themselves through their assignments, and why are we not trying to really sort of like stretch academia, right? Especially the humanities, especially like in the English department. Anyone else thinking about something from last semester or something that's on their mind?
I share the same sentiments as Lucy. Like, I think coming into the class, I was ready. And I think even my readiness to kind of just go through the motions of like the regular academia I was used to, that I didn't relate to, says a lot about how I moved through the class and how like that shifted so quickly when we were reading texts that like related so much to not only the academia but identity as well, like identities that we can relate to. And something I've been thinking about like after the class, which really heavily influenced my article that you were talking about, was intersectionality. And we did touch upon it a little bit in class, but it was more so like what we were reading talked about so many different aspects of someone's identity, and I never related to text so much like that in academia. So I've kind of been searching for it as well, like Lucy was saying, and I think the closest I've reached to that point was I had this writing for social change class where I did talk about identity, and I wrote about identity, and that was before taking the History of Rhetoric class. And something still felt missing. Like I knew what I was writing and like the injustices I was feeling at the time, but I had no idea where they came from or why that was so important, or even like the rhetoric of what I was feeling. And so I think that class gave me like an outlet for that, and I've just been looking for it ever since.
Oh my goodness. So great. A great way to like sort of like plant and position this this podcast episode today, and also like for you, especially because I know that you're applying and you're going to graduate school and you're continuing the education beyond. It's probably a question that you're going to keep trying to find the answer to, especially depending on the institution that you go and what you're trying to do with your your graduate degree. But fear not, because you can do that work even if it's not there, right? And that's the point of like doing work in scholarship, because hey, let me find space or create space or brave space, right? And that's why I think the beginning of last semester, I opened up our History of Rhetoric course with that like very long 2-minute scene from the film Goat, where the scene itself, you have a group of shirtless white fraternity brothers that are like jumping around, chanting, screaming, pounding their chests, drinking excessively, and like really we got to see that like ritualized hazing practice. And like while we were watching that, and it was very slow motion, right? For those who have never seen the movie Goat, it was slow motion because the scene itself is stylized to emphasize like the emotional intensity of like Rush, and hazing, and we got to really see that performative nature of fraternity culture. And so when I was showing that clip to the class, it was interesting to watch the body language in the room and to read the room and to see your responses. I don't know if you remember that, or if you still like have some sort of like reaction to that, or what you were thinking about, to sort of like as it connects to our conversation today.
I kind of have something to say. Like, I think it's kind of in the sense, I see it more than ever because I go to the bars so often, and every other weekend here I go in Hoboken, and I don't know, like ever since I took your class, Dr. B, like it's literally been like I can't unsee it. I can't unsee what, the conversations we've had where, oh, if you don't have a drink, like where's your drink, or that sort of pressure as well. It still lingers, and sometimes I even look for that sort of like what's the word, like like some understanding to the class, that like the conversations of like, oh mom, like like I tell her like, look, I learned about this, and basically how AA is not really as great as it seems. Like there's certain like conversations on that she didn't know, or my sister even kind of, because she works for like government, like she even talks about like, oh, like, well, but really, is that really true? Like there's still that kind of like uncertainty in many like people, and I feel like all around, like they kind of just don't see it. Like there's that like propaganda almost. I don't know.
No, I'm glad that you said that, and then I don't want to take up too much time because I want to hold space for more, especially as it relates to that scene. But when you were sharing about that, and even like connecting it to the conversation that we had later about, like the structure of 12-step recovery and AA, and sort of thinking about identity, going back to what Alyssa said before, then like talking about Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, and trying to have these broader conversations about like the layers of identity in certain institutionalized spaces. Of course, like we would try to have those conversations in History of Rhetoric course, and I did tell you, I warned you, right, that once you see it, you're not going to be able to unsee it. Okay, what about anybody else?
I think a big part of that beginning clip of GOAT and the institutional culture is about, I think a big part of that foundational rhetoric is about, it's always worked before, like why change any of it? And I think with the movie GOAT, with the opening scene being about this fraternity, and just the, with was it Derrida that brought up just giving away your power because that's what's been done before, like just kind of going with the flow of what has already been done and what already hasn't worked, but still thinking that you can be the difference, or that it's going to be a change in your particular experience. And I think rhetoric is just a matter of, it's always worked like this, it's always been done this way, so why are we changing it? And I think a big part of that, a big part of what you're trying to do is dismantle that idea of, well, why can't it be different? If it's always worked before but it hasn't actually really worked for everyone, why can't it just move into something that works for everybody?
Yeah, and I like that you said that, and I feel like I see some of the people getting ready to unmute, so I'm going to hold space for that too. But we also did explore a little bit with like Kenneth Burke, talking about, because we were talking a lot about identity and identification, right? And so Burke argues that persuasion functions through shared symbols, behaviors, collective identity formation. I started the semester with that image, that scene, because the fraternity brothers in GOAT are not just socializing, right? They're participating in a rhetorical performance that is not just limited to drinking excessively, fraternity culture, brotherhood. It also mirrors academia as an institution as well. That's based on like hypermasculinity, white male privilege, alcohol consumption, and on and on. So that chanting and chest pounding, it was functioning rhetorically because they established that group cohesion, and it reinforced that system of power that Courtney, that you were talking about. Okay, some others.
Just to go off that system of power, I know we talked about Foucault a lot. Am I saying that right? I always like
Foucault.
I always practice saying his name and I always still get it wrong. But he defines that people can be a subject under power in two ways. The first one being feeling like they need like a codependent, or you're feeling like you're bound to someone. But the one I found most interesting was the second one, which I think was shown in that fraternity clip, was where that performance kind of becomes your identity and you're kind of used to that like social structure already. And that's something that was so new to me, because he said when we try to question power, it doesn't work if so many people are still under that codependent, or that it's like normal. It's seen as normal, so why would you question it? You know what I mean? So I think when you showed that, it just opened my eyes to a new way, like that we relate to the world and how performance is rhetoric, and so much of our identity is tied to this power.
Yeah, and Foucault always finds his way in. Like it just always wiggles his way in. Because here's the deal, right? We're thinking about disciplinary institutions, the production of bodies. So the fraternity house operates as an institution with its own rules, rituals, punishments, and performances that's all been normalized through, and I love that there's a doggy and cats that are joining us on our podcast. I'm surprised my cat hasn't made a cameo yet. But, the night is still young. So, but we have these hazing rituals, so the body itself becomes disciplined in a particular narrative version of masculinity. Now, whether or not we have had experiences of that masculinity in higher ed, oh my God, this is where I'm going to be dubbing it out because I've now lost my train of thoughts. Let me backtrack. So we have a particular version of masculinity here. So that is why in that class, I was asking you to see rhetoric not as just persuasion through language, but also persuasion through institutional practice and embodied conformity. Okay, what else? Come on. I love the thoughts going around the room here.
Yeah, I think that this whole idea, especially with the clip and what we're talking about with rhetoric, it comes down to the idea that, defining rhetoric as exclusively written text is really ridiculous, if not absurd. I think in order to talk about this, you have to kind of define rhetoric, and I think everybody that I've talked to has a very different definition of rhetoric. The internet has very different definitions of rhetoric. I always say that, I know an English class is going to be hard if it has the word rhetoric in it. But I define it just as the way that people talk about things with an intent, a goal, or a purpose, or just even the way that people talk. And I think that goes so much beyond, written text or verbal speech. It also encompasses body language. Like Alyssa was saying, performance is rhetoric, and institutional culture, ritual, and that's what you're seeing kind of in these fraternities, or at least in scenes like that, because, of course, this is a fictional scene, but it is representative of, very real things that these institutions uphold. And when you have ideals within those institutions of masculinity, that rhetoric can get sort of toxic, and it can make certain people feel very unwelcome. So, rhetoric goes way beyond just written text, and you have it in almost, every community that's going to have an in and out group. You have that rhetoric, whether it's, AA rhetoric or Alcoholics Anonymous or recovering rhetorics. Part of that is having those meetings. Part of that is sharing in a circle. And that's absolutely rhetoric, just the action of that itself. Queer communities use rhetoric as a protective language to identify themselves and others and create communities. Same with, you could make that argument for African American vernacular or other types of English vernacular, Appalachian vernacular, a big thing with Spanglish, the mixing of Spanish and English. And I think all of that is rhetoric. And to say that it's not, and that even something like body language is not rhetoric, I think is so ridiculous and such a tired idea, because rhetoric can be anything belonging to a group. I think a lot of people in higher ed just don't want to say that because they don't want to have to open up that conversation of talking about other types of rhetoric, and especially marginalized communities and how that functions for them as identity and protection.
Yeah, and I mean, just to piggy off of that, piggy off. I told you I would make mistakes. Just to follow up on that, our entire conversation last semester was framed by unit, right? We talked about ethos, which was thinking about hierarchy, how to gain status by performing, loyalty and endurance, right? We were also talking about pathos, which was thinking of, language that was surrounding through emotional intensity, fear, humiliation. We talked about shame, right? We had a whole entire class about shame with like rhetoric and language, especially about, recovery is concerned, and this idea of like collective of knowledge, right? Then we had kairos, which was thinking about ritualization, right? Initiation practices, social pressure, right? How to like belonging in certain spaces, especially in communities that have such rigid institutionalized cultures. We talked about telos, which was like the overarching purpose of assimilation within these structures. And then we even talked about logos, right? Thinking about the logic of these cultures. So we did work in this class, right? We did think about it in the way of like, okay, we might not have had the sort of like certain rhetorics that have been taught, right? And I love that you said, Lucy, when you hear the word rhetoric, I'm initially scared. Right? Like, I paraphrase what you said, because yeah, I mean, that was my experience too. I stayed away from rhetoric and writing as much as I could. I mostly identified as a literature sort of like focus before I went into later graduate school, because I also had a certain impression about what rhetoric was, which was really like classic traditionalist framing of rhetoric, which seemed very scary to me. It reminds me of a lot of a literary theory class, these big books, But really, I didn't know that in a history of rhetoric course, or even thinking about rhetoric and writing, that I could interrogate masculinity, power, whiteness, these rhetorical constructs, right? To say like, hey, these aren't really neutral categories, right? So I think like this kind of work became foundational for our course, because what I hope that it did was to sort of shift rhetoric away from this sort of lived system of like how rhetoric has been taught, especially like when people say rhetoric, oh, they think persuasion. That's all rhetoric is about, is persuasion, right? Teaching about persuasive writing and persuasive speaking. And so I think for me, and I think we're going to keep this conversation going, is that for those of you who are listening, rather than treating rhetoric as something that's like fossilized in ancient philosophy, I just think of like the bug in the amber, like frozen. That's what I'm thinking of right now. You can recognize that rhetoric is still an active force, especially now more than ever in 2026, when we're thinking about how rhetoric shapes identity, institutions, bodies, and communities, especially in today's very political present moment, right? So, okay, cool. Let's keep the conversation going. So what is your experience still navigating the hallways and classrooms of the university after like having had our class, thinking about what, some of you talked about like, oh, I got access to literature and to knowledge that still seems somewhat distant to me. I don't know, does my connection to my outside community sort of feels distant and maybe disconnected from the reality within the institution? Like, how am I thinking about my body now, having had an opportunity to question and to understand systems and rhetorical spaces, but now I'm back in these other spaces? Like, has that questioning like sort of been turned off for you, or have you sort of had to like put it away? Talk to me. And I mean, that was my questions, as you know from my class, tend to be very layered. They don't actually have one question involved, so there's no right or wrong answer, but just something that you're thinking about, like, what does it mean to now walk through the hallways of the institution after having had that class?
I think taking the rhetoric course just brings more awareness. Kind of like what we were saying before, like once you take it, you're not going to be able to go back to kind of how you were before, and it's like in every little thing that I do. And it just brings, I think awareness brings different perspectives and empathy on various situations. Like, it's not just about, like you said, the art of persuasion, but we can be influenced by so many things. And so when we were talking about shame for a whole class, I think at first I was like, yeah, like, bring shaming back. I think that's like something I said like in my ignorant little bubble. But after, having gone through the whole class, I empathize in the ways that people are influenced, in the ways that I'm influenced. I think I remember you said one thing that like stuck with me forever. We were just talking about like the whole drug culture of America and how we view like homeless people, and how like when people think of homeless people, they think, oh, they're just doing drugs. They don't care about life. But then when you realize that like alcohol and drugs is such a big part of our culture, and there's so many different ways that we're influenced and so many different ways that we end up where we end up. It has changed like my perspective, like even walking outside, you know what I mean? So I definitely have more awareness and more of like, it's always in the back of my mind of like, okay, instead of bringing shaming back, like how did we get here? How were we influenced? And just knowing that I could end up in the same spot, you know what I mean? Like there's not really such a great divide anymore between me and other people when you think of rhetoric in that lens.
I'm so glad that you had like returned to that, because that was such a great class. Because I remember specifically in that class, it turned into a debate, and it was like, yes, this is great, right? Because the reality is that, you know, rhetoric is asking us how to think about how something is framed and how it can be reframed, right? So the I would say the canonical rhetorical concepts are not like actually dead, but I think the way that they've been taught and the way that or they have been taught previously strips them of the sort of like urgency of re-looking at them and like re-evaluating them, right? So I say, hey, listen, that's why we brought forward some of those older canonical concepts, because where do we see that happening today? And I remember shame being that like really big debate, because woof, depending on our personal lived experiences, it asks us to think about like who's been excluded from those conversations historically and who's still excluded based on even just a very simple principle of shame. What about anybody else? Oh, Genesee, go ahead. Oh, on mute. Go for it.
I think right now, especially like looking at things that are going on. I'm so sorry. He has decided. But looking at things that are going on in the world and stuff like that, and kind of thinking back to that class, that particular debate in terms of shame. I don't think shame is necessarily a horrible thing to bring back. To some extent, there are certain people right now that require the ability to even fucking feel shame. And so the ability to I think with when it comes to rhetoric, it's a double-edged sword, both understanding it and seeing it, but also remembering that you are inherently slave to it, or not slave to it, but susceptible to it, because like you have people who you might consider some really intelligent, really thoughtful, really well-read people, and you'll speak to them about certain things, again pertaining to a lot of what's going on politically in the world today, and you'll hear them say something, and you'll sit there and kind of rub your eye and think, I can't believe I looked up to you. But a lot of that has to do with like this idea of things not being able to change because of the rhetoric, that change could be something horrible that is put out there. So it's kind of like, yeah, I mean that's kind of what has been on my mind as of late, just because again, just everything. Like today I read an article about a 10-year-old boy who wrote a essay for his class. He had to write a persuasive essay, and he wrote a persuasive essay about electrical cars and why we should be, trying to switch over to electrical cars and make it easier for people to do it. And his teacher, really liked it, and he decided he was going to send it to his representative in North Carolina. And the representative responded to him and essentially said that he was being brainwashed by his teacher. And this is an 80-something-year-old woman. She got cataracts coming in on her goddamn eyes. Like, literally, you can see the cataracts in one eye. And she, wrote back a response with her own citations. And it's like, dude, you're dealing with a 10-year-old boy. One, you don't have to go that hard. That's one. Two, you yourself, ironically enough, were once a teacher back when, you actually had skin. So instead of leather. So like, come on. Let's be real here. You know what it was like back then. You know what it was like to be in that seat. Now, granted, to some extent, you had a little bit more freedom in what you could teach, and also considering the time frame you were around, you were probably a bit of a bigot. But you know, times have changed. But it's that rhetoric is so seated, that idea is so seated that even something as simple as, you know, as the current story coming out of the MAGA Republicans, for instance. You know what I mean? And the rhetoric that's being pushed by them and the Heritage Foundation, and like, it's enough to kind of bring a lot of that back up, to feel comfortable to fall into those lines again, and again, kind of going back to Alyssa's idea of shame. Like, that's part of the reason they can't feel shameless, because that rhetoric also tells them that they're just. So it's just.
No, and I'm glad that you had said all that and you covered for those who don't know, Genesee always comes in with some humor, which I do appreciate. Disarms us a little bit, but I think what you're talking about too is like there's like the deeper level of it is like there is a discomfort when like privileged rhetoric is rejected, right? And you just said that. You talked about that particular instance with the student creating this project and writing this essay and then being challenged and then trying to like going back to holding that placement again about education, literacy, and knowledge. Because if institutions continue to insist on applying these classical concepts to contemporary lived realities, how can the academy, like, for us, we can't say, like, how could you say that your experience as an academy of an institution of learning is going to stay separate from the theory that you're asking us to study, right? Like, I mean, we're just pointing out the question of legitimacy of rhetoric history, right? What is legitimate, right? What topics and what spaces are allowed to be historically recognized as worthy of intellectual study? Okay, so anyone else before we jump into the next question? Yeah, Itzel, go for it.
Yeah, so I don't know. I kind of just got like a little struck with the whole idea of rhetoric because at some point in my life, I remember rhetoric just being exactly what, I don't know, I think Alyssa said it, the art of persuasion. And, like that's the one thing, even going into high school, coming into your freshman year of college, you're only like, these institutions only teach you that. Just the art of persuasion. Like, oh, you have your ethos, pathos, logos, and, it's about sympathy, it's about persuasion, it's about, your credibility. And then you're put like, and then you come across like obviously like honestly one of the best classes, which was your class, Dr. B, about, like different, ways of rhetoric. And, Lucy even mentioned how, rhetoric can be even in the way you're moving, like, like your body, your body is your language as well. And, like honestly, I haven't even like dived even deeper into that idea myself because I feel like sometimes I feel like I was in a bubble even before your class. I felt like it was essentially that like like the institutions of colleges kind of just have this idea that, oh, it's by the book, so it's the art of persuasion and that's what it is. And we don't go into further depth into different topics like about whether rhetoric is in AA or it's in like like different groups like it can be anything, honestly. And, I personally, I think I was very ignorant to that idea. And even into shame, I think I kind of got pushed back into the idea that, like, you kind of just look at homeless people and like, oh yeah, like, like they've just, you judge them essentially instead of having sympathy. And also, again, like shame is, I remember specifically, I was also like, yeah, bring back shame, like, because I guess I was a little ignorant as well, like Alyssa, where we were like, wait a minute, you kind of just reflect. And I do a lot of reflecting. And I remember even going into the city and I'm like, yeah, like genuinely, like you just don't know. Like there's just so many cases of people that have different things going on, whether it's drug addiction, alcohol addiction, any kind of drug. And, like the first thing we as humans tend to do is just judge immediately or not know. Like there's no knowledge. And I think that it's so important for these college like institutions to bring back this, like entire like game of like, it's not just rhetoric isn't just the art of persuasion. It's also, there's many different parts to it more, and I think it would definitely like, like at least for me, it brought back a lot more reflection, a lot more knowledge, because now I can't unsee it. Now it's like I understand. Oh, wait a minute. Like when I'm drinking or I'm at the bar, like, do I need a drink? Like, can't I just, like enjoy myself? Why is it that I'm being questioned like by other, like when a guy approaches me, oh, where's your drink? Like, that sort, and I'm like, do I need a drink? Like, it kind of just makes me like reevaluate, like, wait a minute, like, that sort of like idea that we were, those discussions we had about, your rhetoric, and also just like, I don't know, like overall, like, even the addiction of alcohol, or even like just in general. Yeah.
No, I'm glad you said all that, and let me try to like weed through all of the really great things that you said. I mean, one of the things is that rhetoric is in space, right? I don't mean Deep Space Nine. I mean in the spaces, right? Whether that's at the table that you're gathering with family, whether it's at the supermarket, whether it's at the local bar, whether it's in the cafeteria at the university, whether it's in the college, whether it's in an AA meeting. I mean, that's the goal, right? It's to understand that rhetoric is everywhere. Now, the understanding that you should also move towards is that with rhetoric, there are biases that come with it, judgments, there are systems of power, there's knowledge, there's community practice, and then there's also like with that framing, there's a counterpublic, which is like the people who don't play by the same rules or see exactly for what it is or what has been told to us. We can't even touch on the topic of colonization today because, that's also a sort of, from what I understand and the way that I see it, the rhetorical canon privileges figures like Plato and Aristotle because they were positioned in systems of institutionalized power, education, citizenship, and authorship, which is basically the underpinning of colonization, right? And so a lot of us, like when I heard you and Alyssa, I see Alyssa raise her hand. I didn't even know you could do that on here, but there you go for figuring that out. Ignorance, I wouldn't even call it ignorance. I would just say like, wow, this is sort of like the production of colonization, right? Like how I showed up to that conversation based on my lived experiences, especially people who identify as, women of color. Like I didn't realize like, wow, how I was showing up in that moment was based on all of these literacies and these rhetorical practices that have been passed down to me through the sort of like framing of colonization, which is such a huge conversation, right? So I want you to move away from ignorance and to really think of it that way, because ignorance makes it seem like it's really all on you, when it's not. The larger conversation is to see how rhetoric has sort of like trickled down, right? Alyssa, you had a hand.
Yeah, I was just gonna like put it back to Kenneth Burke and semiotics, and just what Lucy was saying, like how ridiculous it is to think that rhetoric is just the art of persuasion, but really how it can be influenced in anything and everything, because we tend to gravitate to symbols and our meanings behind them that we put behind them, but even like those meanings can have rhetoric in them. Like we were talking about when Nick Jr. was around, like even like the after 10 p.m. like mommy needs a drink special, you know what I mean? And I'm like, whoa, like I was watching that. I was watching that, and yeah, my bedtime was like at 8 p.m. whatever, but like kids are so influential, and everyone's so influential, and seeing things like that, it just reminds me of like when they used to put it in like in the 1800s, when they used to put like drinking in advertisements for kids, like it was seen as medicinal, and they would put it like with they'd put families on it because we symbolize family with oh well, they must be right, like oh they adore families, they prioritize families, and they must be right because of what we think of when we think of like the American dream and families and stuff like that. And you're right, like colonization is we're gonna need like 2 more hours for that if we get into that, but just seeing like how everything is influenced, or how everything is influential as well, has just like opened my mind so much, broke my brain, as you say.
I love that. It did. And so that's why I totally did a leap back towards my desk. But I don't know if you remember when I brought this to class. Sometimes my mom drinks too much. And we talked a lot about obviously, we definitely deconstructed the white cis heteronormative family structure that's represented in this book, in addition to the sort of blaming structure of women who struggle with alcohol abuse and addiction. And I think this is a really nice segue for our conversation because towards the middle to the end of the semester we started studying queer rhetoric, recovery rhetoric, feminist recovery theory. We shifted our attention more to moving away from a little bit of the canon to more towards rhetorics about that were situated in marginalized spaces. Some of you went on to, you attended, right? One of our assignments was for you to attend an open AA meeting, right? And some of you did that, whether it was on Zoom or in a church basement or somewhere else. And you were really we started to think about how spaces are rarely treated, especially spaces like that are rarely treated by academia as sites of intellectual production, right? And they involve a lot of persuasion. There's a lot of identity formation happening. There's a lot of storytelling. There's a lot of collective language practices and meaning making. So I think my question would be for you to think about what happens when rhetoric, as we talked about a little bit before, what happens when rhetoric becomes embodied, when it begins addressing queerness, trauma, gender, and survival in ways that maybe make the theory more political, more emotionally present than what has been done before?
I think it definitely expands just, our understanding of rhetoric and then how that goes back into academia, because I feel as an English major, the advice that people are always giving you for writing is to write what you know. And my entire education, whether it was high school, now college, as an English major, I have never, ever, until I took this class, wrote about my experiences as a lesbian woman, which is crazy for me because I talk about it all the time. All of my whole social circle is queer. It's every aspect of my life. My roommate, I live in a queer household, but it's what I know the most, and I've never followed that advice of writing what I know. And finally, when I did that, I found, I can do this and I'm good at writing about this stuff because it is what I know. So when you open that idea of rhetoric and have it be more embodied and see the way that it interacts and intersects with certain communities, it can, of course, get political, but that's what higher education is. It's about having complex thought and complex discussion. And I don't see necessarily a problem with things ever getting political. I feel like that's the nature of life. If you have one conversation for long enough, it's going to get political, and that's fine. I don't know why we're so scared of, those things and having, differing opinions between students and professors, because that's what upper education should be about, conversation, and it should make you feel things, and literature should make you feel things. So I think just opening rhetoric to that, like you were saying, that embodied experience of different groups allows for more voices to be heard. And at least for me, as a writer, if I didn't get to hear those voices, like Jean Swallow and Holly Whitaker, and even, your text that you've written, I wouldn't have felt comfortable writing about my queer experiences because I never thought that I could before. So then that creates this chain reaction of people who are able to talk about these things and put them back into academia, where, how many decades have gone by where people had so much to say about, the rhetoric of their community, but they were too afraid to do it. So I think it like I said, it influences that chain reaction. It's really important to include other voices in academia because there's so much to be studied. Even in those ads about alcoholism and, those vintage ones that Alyssa, you were talking about, mommy needs a cocktail thing, those are pieces of history. Those are pieces of rhetoric. The fact that they would be discouraged from being taught in academia or in a classroom makes no sense to me, because we should be looking at all histories, all things that, seem irrelevant to one person might be extremely relevant to another based on your preferred area of study. And that's the great part about writing, is there could be 100 English majors in a room, but they all are writing and focusing on different things. So I don't think we should ever limit, what's allowed and what's not allowed, because everything is research.
Yeah, I love that you said that. And actually, it made me think about a moment that I had, which still to this day, it's a short, I think we did it in class. I don't know if I remember seeing it to you. It's called, oh yeah, maybe we did. Sleeping with Alcohol by Donna Steiner. I think we did. Yeah. Because I wanted to show you a short essay, and so I came across that text in 2007 in a creative nonfiction undergraduate class at St. John's University, and I literally was like, oh my god. I had just come out, like I was newly baby gay, right, out of the closet. And I was like, oh my god, did she assign this because she knows that I'm gay? Like, what's happening? What's happening? Because I never came across a text like that in my life. Ever. I mean, I was like almost 22 years old, and it was the first time I was reading about love between women. I mean, that's crazy, right? I mean, back then it's probably not that crazy, but it was wild to me. And I think like it's such an interesting example to think about, like, wow, like if we're in academia and we're in the institution, like why are we still encouraging students to maintain distance and objectivity from their lived experiences when discussing theory, right? Like why are we not talking more about grief, queerness, trauma, community survival, especially now? Like even if we are talking about a certain topic thematically or from the syllabus, why aren't we not bringing the conversation to a larger discussion about the definition of literacy and rhetorical practice? Like, because those conversations can reveal so much more with like going back on like what you said, Lucy, about like what has been and what hasn't been acknowledged within the academy. And so, listen, here's the deal. Academia is much more comfortable validating rhetoric that is rooted in institutional privilege and prestige. That's the truth, right? So if we hang on to these philosophical texts, if we keep recapitulating certain types of political discourses, and, if we continue to center the elite academic traditions, then we don't have to acknowledge those marginalized or community-based spaces. And who would think walking into a history of rhetoric course, you're going to be talking about the power structures within an AA meeting in a church basement? Like, what? Alyssa, you wrote an article, right, from our class. Like, talk to me a little bit about that article. And just for a little bit of a tidbit before you continue, we'll probably push until 2:15 if that's okay for everybody, because we're having a good combo. Okay, cool. All right, Alyssa, go for it.
Yeah, I was actually just gonna lead into that and like just commend you on teaching so many different perspectives. I think of course it is important to like go back to the roots, and like it was the history of like learning about like Bill Wilson and Bob Smith that I was able to, I guess, get to where I am now. But you included so many other perspectives than just that. And I think it wasn't until we talked about like I guess leading into, yeah, when we were reading like queer literature, that's when also I was also presented to intersectionality, because like so many of these queer women that we were reading about were also like women of color or black women, and it was like the first time that I kind of got different perspectives. And then later, as like the semester went on, and even after, I kind of had to look at my own life, and I was like, why do I relate to this so much, because I don't identify as queer, but it was in that struggle in their identity that I was like, wow, like something's really clicking, that I wasn't in a place where I was aware of how it was clicking. And so I wrote that article, and you helped me with it, which was amazing process. But during that process, it was kind of just me writing about realizing the ways that it was clicking, and having someone that I love dearly struggle with addiction, but also have so many different parts of his identity. And that was like, whoa. Oh my gosh. And so I kind of wrote about my discovery of rhetoric in that intersectionality lens, but also the history and where it comes from, and why it's so important to include so many different voices. And it was like through like after the class, I was intrigued to do my own research, and like I realized that like marginalized communities have been taken out of it for so long. Like how like I think we were talking about like women bookstores, and they were like, those were like the first to like bring out like queer literature and in regards to recovery. And then like how the black community wasn't allowed into AA meetings until they had to set up their own like a random YMCA, you know what I mean? And so when I was discovering all of that, and I was like, okay, that's why it's clicking in my life, because I empathize with that now, and I see like why it hasn't been ideal for the person I love, as a black man. And Man, I'm like losing my train of thought. Wait, let me find it. Let me find it. Let me find it.
You got it. You got it.
Oh no. Yeah, so just seeing how, oh, okay, yes, okay, there you go. I remember I used to, like, 'cause it was all I knew, especially before the class. Oh my gosh, if you were to ask me about anything about addiction recovery and how identity is even formed in that, I'd be like, still, like, just go to AA, you know? But seeing how that really plays a huge part in it, and seeing why that my suggestion in the past wasn't working, and everything we talked about thus far, especially like systems of power and wanting to be included in society, um, it was weird because it's like he wanted to be like, it was feeding his addiction as like this inclusion into society, and like the second form of like the subject that and I forgot again, Foucault. Foucault.
Foucault.
I can't remember. And him like falling into that power, but also being taken out of the institution in a different way, like being like a part of a marginalized community. It's so like the balance is so off scale. Um, yeah, that's kind of what the article was about, kind of just like me trying to unpack that, and still like I feel like I could write another one because there's so much more to say.
Yeah, and can you share the title of your article? Don't mute yet. We're gonna give you a free plug here. Go ahead, title, because it's from a Gen Z magazine, right?
Yeah, it's a Gen Z magazine, so I kind of wanted to use like Gen Z slang. You know, it's called A Gen Z and AA don't go real bad together.
Cool. And what's the title? What's the name of the journal or the magazine?
Trail mag.
Cool, cool, cool. So yeah, it's there, and I have it also on my website as well. So if anybody's interested, you could check out my website.
Shameless plug.
Woo, shameless plug. You got to take it. Come on, where it's you get the credit where it's due. You know, and I
In
love.
the article, we used like a meme. Remember, I don't know if you remember the meme where it's like
I do.
unlearn shame together.
I love it. It was great. Yeah, so it's just for people to know. I just helped Alyssa for the sort of like finishing, like like suggestions and stuff. But it was all Alyssa. And I love that your article revealed the way that rhetoric was operating in such a consequential form as you were thinking about race and culture and identity, right? And like so how powerful. Others that wanted to share too. Like we have time.
I kind of want to go off back to like what you were talking about on the effects of rhetoric. And I remember when we took your class, we also did that big project, which I got really nervous, which was meeting, someone who, was from AA. And me and Alyssa were in doing the project together. And I remember writing some of the questions, my question down, and I was like, I want to be, not that I want to challenge the person, but I want to see how far they go, like, do they actually answer my question the way I wanted it to. And I remember the question, Alyssa, you can like fact check me on this one because I'm a little like on my memory, but so basically, like, I really was just trying to like challenge, our interviewer and saying, higher power, essentially. And, like, I wanted this person to really kind of not admit that there was, biblical, this and kind of like an influence in religion, essentially. Because that's what me and Alyssa, we were like talking about. I was like, I kind of want them to just like kind of see that AA has that, like connection with religion as well. Is there a connection? And she really just kind of like steered away from the whole, like, even the word of it itself. And I remember even Alyssa tried like chiming in, well, higher, and it's still like nothing, like it didn't go through. It just went out the other ear. And I was like, oh, this is the effect. This is the effect of rhetoric. This is what happens when you're so in the bubble, you're so into the influence that nothing can change the opinion. And like going back to like what you're saying, like those are some of, like, at least for me, what I noticed, especially how rhetoric has that big power of holding on someone, like just the way they think. And it's so scary because like like even Alyssa was like, wow, she did not want to answer that question. And I was like, yeah, she really didn't. And I was like, I'm the kind of person who just is very like, oh, well, I want to see where this goes. So, even me like being able to like give that question, I was like, wow, like this kind of just showed for what it was, like she just genuinely had that idea, stuck with it, and didn't want to answer, or I guess I'm not open her eyes because, to each their own, and their ideas. But it kind of just goes off, the whole idea that rhetoric has an effect on people, and it's scary because, it's even like in different cultures, or like ideas or opinions, like this is just the way they think, and nothing can really change like the way they do that. And yeah, that was a big eye opener for me, at least.
That was really funny actually because we asked her so many like hidden questions of like, and I think I remember because we were talking about her family, and she was saying I think it was one of her daughters that was a part of the queer community, and she was also Gen Z. So I was like, but don't you think that maybe and I was like do you think that maybe like some things are a little outdated for how fast things have progressed since the start of AA? And she was just like, no, you take what you will. And I'm like, oh man, like every time we almost hit it, she was just like, no, actually. So that was funny that you brought that up. Like remembering.
I love that. It's such, and I remember watching I remember watching the video, right, in the interview, and I was like, "Whoa, this is so cool!" Right? Mostly because it didn't matter that you would think like, "Oh, Gen Z, they're gonna question, right? They're gonna deconstruct. They're gonna take things like they're gonna study it." But it shows us about like the insiderness, right? I thought it was such a cool moment that you were like still willing to push to like critically engage with this person, like to really ask him to think about the institutional assumptions, especially about how spirituality in AA has been, traditioned from certain religious structures. But like the fear, the innate fear that when somebody's so within an institution, the fear of just even curiosity or just vulnerability or just questioning, the idea of being open is uncomfortable, right? And I think that was like, I think you all in each of your own ways, especially with your final projects, you contributed to the sort of discussion that we were having all semester, that, rhetoric is not static, right? That was like such a powerful moment where like you saw we talked about embodied rhetoric, like as somebody who studies that, like as an autoethnographer, I would literally be making notes like crazy, like, oh my god, they're squirming, like they're shifting the position in their seat, like this question makes them uncomfortable. What about some other perspectives? I know, Lucy, you had a little bit of a contentious experience with the project at the end of the semester, and you had some like questions about like a lot of queer and feminist rhetoric at the end of the semester, and I know that you had wanted to sort of like talk more about that, especially with the final project. So when you arrive, and like, listen, when you come together as a group and you work about, and you had different group members, and you're trying to come together and to sort of create an idea to present to the class, that was also in and of itself like an example of like even how like structures and power dynamics, like rhetoric is not neutral in the moment of like the arriving at the group project. So I think I wanted to know like what your experience was with the group project at the end of the semester, and how you like tried to navigate that in your own way when you wanted to sort of like talk about and represent a certain topic that not everybody was sort of like into.
Right. I mean, like I said, this was the first class that I got to take where I got to really interact and kind of write my own, I guess, queer theory, or, anything pertaining to my identity. So, of course, I really wanted to do that, especially in the format of the final project, which was so much bigger than the other things I got to do. But it was a group project, and I feel the same way about group projects as I do writers' workshops. I think sometimes they're really awesome, but sometimes they can kind of ruin things. If you have an individual goal, because, I agree, I was saying before, that whole thing, right, what I understand if the people within my group were not queer, or didn't, know a lot about queer criticism or feminist criticism or any of those sort of, I guess, lit crit sections. So I understand, why they wouldn't want to do a project on there and not be comfortable, because it's also scary. You don't want to talk about something so sensitive and say it the wrong way, and then people are mad at you. So I get it. But I was really wanted to just do something at least with, women. Specifically, of course, it would have been my dream if I was in, a group with other lesbians and we could just talk about, being lesbians. That would be so much fun, and, I wouldn't want to do that. But I still was able to kind of work in what I wanted to do, because we looked at specifically like replacement addictions and therapies that people kind of go through and cycle through and deal with when they are trying to quit a substance, because it's so common that sex and love addiction as a replacement, which is just very common that there's so many sex and love addiction support groups all over the country, almost as a counter to AA. You have things like gym and working out. You have my friend who I interviewed, Nicole, her big thing for her was tattoos. And she's completely covered, neck down, every inch of her body is covered in tattoos. And I wanted to interview her about that. But I also kind of wanted to see what we could get into with queer rhetoric with her, because she is a queer woman. And I did the best that I could. But I still, even in a class where I was so open and to these queer theories, and we were learning about these queer theories, it's kind of like you said, once you get into this group, I'm quiet, and I'm like, okay, whatever you guys want to, and then I kind of feel insecure about wanting to bridge my identity into this, which of course not everything is for your identity, but this project totally was. And it's so funny how that rhetoric, even though we spent the whole semester deconstructing it, in a second is destroyed, and now I'm like, okay, well, I can't talk about that because, not everyone in this group identifies like that, or they don't want to talk about it, or it's uncomfortable. And it's, I think that was a demonstration in and of itself. I remember when we were presenting, we had, I think throughout the semester, there were male students in the classroom who were interrupting you, and other, female speakers, and it was like, hang on, this is what we're talking about. This is exactly what we're talking about. But I think my experience there with the final project just shows, like I said, how quickly, once we build up this narrative of we're learning about this, we're educating about this, to try to have other voices and other stories, it can crumble like that. Once you're in a position of insecurity, or you get nervous, or things get uncomfortable, suddenly the rhetoric is completely dominated by the status quo again, and you're left with nothing. But at least I got to write my one article about lesbians. That was awesome. That was really fun for me.
Yeah, and what a great way to end the podcast episode, and I loved and hated that moment for you, because listen, this is what I do. I study the room, I study bodies, I study those moments, and I could see the other group members that were working with you on that project, but to actually be interrupted by that patriarchal male voice constantly and cut off, and I was like, ugh. What, where have you been all semester, right? And you were just talking about how quickly that crumbles, in an instant. And I think, if there is one takeaway, which first of all, I feel like the whole episode was a bunch of takeaways that you all had, but I think for one takeaway from that class and that semester is rhetoric is always political. It is never neutral. It is always connected to power and to access and representation. Rhetoric is always considering the ways that people navigate and make meaning in the world, right? Through language and community, and I'm sure maybe we'll co-author an article or something after. Well, the work is not done yet, and the work will never be done, because here's the deal: once you see, you'll never unsee. And I will never forget the first time I started thinking about doing this work and changing because I was a Virginia Woolf scholar. That's what I was going to study Virginia Woolf. That is what my dissertation was going to be on. And then once I got a little bit of a taste for rhetoric and writing and writing studies, I was like, oh, there's this other really cool world. What's happening here? Because once I got to see, I couldn't unsee. I'll never forget, I was sitting in my mentor's office, and I was like, so I think I'm going to write about AA, thinking about power and being queer. And she's like, why are you whispering? And I was like, because I'm afraid people are going to hear me, and that's such a huge lesson about, thinking about the social forces that's connected to rhetoric, right? And so, well, anyways, thanks for listening to the Queer Stories of Recovery, Voices from the Margin podcast. Thank you to these amazing scholars, our participants today, for contributing to the discussion. Thank you for everyone who's out there in the world, who's not afraid to ask really difficult questions about language, power, and communities, because as we know, there are a lot of us in our stories that are left at the margins of rhetorical history. Stay tuned. We have another episode coming in a month.
Thank you for listening to the Queer Stories of Recovery podcast. If you like this episode, share it with a friend, a coworker, a family member, or someone you just met today. Until next time, live out loud, keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep writing your stories.